Hey guys, tonight we're gathering under the soft glow of the nightlight to dive into a story so bizarre you'll think you're fever dreaming in a velvet robe. Imagine a royal dynasty so obsessed with keeping their bloodline pure that, after centuries, their faces began to defy all normal human proportions. Picture portraits where the lower jaw juts out like a broken hinge, lips constantly parted in stunned confusion, and eyes that seem to beg someone to rescue them from the canvas. This isn't some medieval horror fiction, it's a true tale of power, pride, and a gene pool so shallow you could sprain your ankle stepping into it. Think you've heard your fair share of weird family stories? Trust me, you're about to hear the legend of a royal bloodline so incestuous, you might not even have the guts to sip your late-night tea afterward. So before you get too cozy, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel only if you truly enjoy what we're doing here. And while we wait for the story to begin, drop a comment to let me know, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a soft fan for some background hum. And let's sink into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with an image. A vast room draped in red carpet and lined with portraits of the most powerful people in Europe. They wear brocade robes embroidered with gold thread, crowns studded with jewels on their heads, gazing down at mortals with the unshakable belief that their blood and theirs alone was destined to rule the world. They were the Habsburgs, a dynasty that once ruled nearly half the continent, from the peaks of the Alps to the plains of Spain. But if you move closer and look more carefully at the portraits, you'll see something isn't right. It's not just the stern faces of nobility, it's the faces themselves, unusually long, with jaws jutting out as if trying to escape their own heads, and lips drooping open, unable to close over malformed teeth. They called it the Habsburg Jawa genetic legacy that this dynasty nurtured through generations of inbreeding. They believed royal blood must remain intact, untainted, unmixed with anyone lesser. They married cousins, nieces, even second nieces, and with each passing generation, those faces grew more and more deformed, as if a curse were gradually surfacing beneath all the velvet and power. Imagine a child born unable to close their mouth, a tongue so large it prevented speech, a skull so deformed that midwives screamed upon delivering it. This was the tragedy of Charles III, last king of the Spanish Habsburgs. From the time he was an infant, Charles's body could not support itself. He needed a head brace. I couldn't feed himself, and didn't speak until nearly 8 years old. As he grew, Charles remained just a shadow of a king, seated on a throne yet utterly powerless against his own body. Servants secretly called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. They whispered that demons had taken his soul, but the truth was darker still. There was no curse, only centuries of incest. Look closely at the details in those ancient portraits, the distant eyes, the slack jaw, the chin that seems to be falling away. These weren't artistic exaggerations. They were silent evidence of the cost of unrelenting pride, a price no throne could hide. If you're wondering why such a powerful family chose to walk down a genetic dead end, the answer is simple. They believed they were God's chosen bloodline. They believed their blood was divine, and in that blind faith, they turned their family into a biological experiment, breeding tragedy from one generation to the next. They never considered opening the castle gates, marrying someone ordinary, trading purity for health and the future of their children. To them, preserving the purity of the bloodline was more important than happiness, than life itself, more important than reason. So tonight, as you listen to this story in the quiet of the dark, remember, power isn't always triumph. Sometimes, it is the beginning of a silent curse, waiting generations to reveal its true form. Are you still awake? If you're still listening, imagine the ancient oak doors of El Escorial creaking open. In the dim light, a child is carried out before the court, a child so small that everyone glances at each other with concern. though no one dares speak the truth. It is 1661, and Charles II is born. From the very first moment, they knew something was wrong. His head was misshapen, his lower jaw unusually long, and his tongue so large he couldn't close his mouth. They placed him on a golden embroidered pillow and called him a divinely appointed king. But everyone understood he was the living embodiment of centuries of incest brought to their breaking point. Charles's childhood was nothing short of a survival trial. He couldn't crawl, couldn't stand, and didn't take his first steps until nearly 4. Every movement was a struggle, his muscles too weak to obey. In later years, he still couldn't form complete sentences until nearly 8, when he finally uttered a few words. The court sighed in relief as though witnessing a miracle. But the miracle didn't last. Charles grew into an increasingly distorted body. His jutting jaw made it impossible to chew solid food. Every meal was a torment. Meat had to be minced, soaked in broth, so he could swallow without choking. Many times, he turned blue mid-meal, and servants had to prop him upright so he could breathe. His room was always cold. Charles was frail, his pale skin perpetually damp with cold sweat. He often lay still for hours, eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling, saying nothing. During Zeitzulas, his whole body would convulse, white foam spilling from his mouth, terrifying the maids into fleeing the room. Even so, Charles was still king. The court had to maintain every solemn ceremony, as if he were a healthy, capable monarch. Each morning, he was dressed in a red robe, crowned with jeweled regalia, and carried to the audience chamber. In the golden candlelight, he sat motionless, his eyes dull as he looked upon the nobles bowing low before the throne. They pretended to praise his wisdom and authority, but in truth, they were all waiting for him to die. Charles had 2 marriages. The first was to Marie-Louise d'Orléans, a beautiful French princess sent as a diplomatic gift. Marie-Louise was just 17 when she arrived in Madrid and immediately sensed the tragedy. Her husband, the king of a vast empire, was unable to fulfill the duties of a husband. He was too weak, too ill, and too lost within his own body. They lived together for 10 years without a single child. Marie-Louise grew increasingly desperate, drowning in loneliness and cruel rumors. People whispered she was a witch, that she had cursed the king into impotence. Eventually, she died young after a violent fever. Some said it was sorrow that killed her. After that, Charles married Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess known for her cunning. But no matter how clever she was, she couldn't rescue her husband's failing body. They had no children, and when early fertility examinations were conducted, the physicians exchanged grim looks. His semen was watery, lifeless. Oh, in his final years, Charles became more like a ghost. He was frail, nearly toothless, his hair thinning, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. His body was a cage, imprisoning the helpless soul of a king who never had control over his fate. People still knelt before him, still praised the sanctity of the Habsburg dynasty. But deep down, everyone knew it had ended long ago, and Charles was merely the living witnesser, rather, a decaying body slowly disintegrating on the throne. When he died in 1700, not yet 40 years old, the autopsy became legend. His intestines were full of pus and rot. His heart was too small, his liver hard as stone. One doctor reportedly exclaimed, "This body died many years before it stopped breathing." Now, it was the inevitable end, a conclusion sown centuries earlier by the blind faith in pure blood. Life, are you still here? If you're still awake, let me tell you more about the other faces, children born only to prove that sometimes nobility can be the greatest curse. We've just left the final moments of Charles III, king whose body had already decayed while he still lived. But his death wasn't merely the end of a man. It was the final blow that severed the withering branch of the Spanish Habsburg tree. When Charles drew his last breath, the court fell into silence. No heir, no direct successor, no clear plan for the throne of this enormous empire. Inside the palace, servants whispered of omens foretold decades earlier, but beyond the thick stone walls, all of Europe had been waiting for that moment. Messengers rode through the night, carrying the news to Versailles, Vienna, London. Other kings, other dynasties saw the Spanish throne as a ripe prize that had just collapsed. They called it the War of the Spanish Succession, a battle not just of swords, but of deals, betrayal, and ambition. While Charles lived, he was a feeble shield holding back the storm. But with his death, nothing remained to stop the stronger powers from tearing apart the lands his ancestors had claimed through centuries of marriage and war. The Spanish court descended into chaos. The nobility split into factions. Some wanted to give the crown to the French Bourbon, others to the Austrian Habsburgs. The people were frightened, facing famine, disease, and foreign armies at the border. And bitterly enough, it all stemmed from a persistent belief that the Habsburg bloodline was too sacred to be diluted. To protect that belief, they sacrificed the happiness of generation after generation, and in the end, offered their throne to history as a cautionary tale. Close your eyes and imagine the scene. In a cold, vast room, and the bed where Charles II died still carries the faint scent of ointments used to mask the stench of decay. In the corridor, nobles dressed in black robes crowd together, debating the fate of an empire their king had failed to save. They say that when the doctors left the palace, they didn't dare look one another in the eye. In their hearts, they all knew they hadn't just witnessed the death of a sickly man. They had just witnessed the end of 700 years of Spanish Habsburg history. When Charles II died, he left behind a controversial will. The throne was to pass to Philip, the grandson of King Louis XIV of Francia, a young Bourbon prince. The Austrian Habsburgs were enraged. Their cousins in Vienna believed the crown rightfully belonged to their own branch of the family. And so, Europe ignited with ambition. Kings signed alliances, changed sides, and betrayed one another. The armies of France, England, Austria, the Netherlands all marched onto the Iberian Peninsula. Spanish towns were burned to the ground. Civilians starved or fled into exile. It was a war both long and senseless, all to claim a throne whose last occupant could barely stand on his own. Close your eyes and imagine a moment in the battlefield, soldiers in silver armor trampling across dew-soaked fields. Commands shouted in 4 different languages. Meanwhile, to the portraits of Charles II still hung coldly on the palace walls, deformed face gazing down upon a world he left in chaos. The war lasted 13 years, from 1701 to 1714. It drained Spain and redrew the map of European power. In the end, Philip was recognized as King of Spain, but only on the condition that he renounce his right to the French throne, so that the two empires would never merge into a single colossal force. As for the Spanish Habsburg Empire, once mighty and stretching to the Americas, it crumbled into smaller parts. Territories in Italy, the Netherlands, and strategic fortresses fell into the hands of Austria or Britain. And then, the name Habsburg in Spain faded into the past. The red brick palaces, the proud ceremonies, and the sacred bloodline, once exalted for centuries, were left only in memory. Like a dark fairy tale without a happy ending. There is an irony. While kings fought for every inch of land, distant Habsburg descendants still quietly lived on in Austria. That dynasty, though weakened, continued for a few more generations after Charles died, but none of them believed blindly in pure blood anymore. The genetic fears, the grotesque legacy borne by Charles II, had become a warning no one dared ignore. In title, he was the absolute ruler of Spain, sovereign of the Iberian Peninsula, much of southern Italy, the Spanish Netherlands, and colonies across the Americas and the Philippines. But in reality, Charles was merely a ceremonial figure, a talisman used to keep the crown in the hands of courtiers and family. As a child, his mother, Queen Regent Mariana of Austria, held all the power. She came from the Austrian Habsburgs, raised under strict religious discipline. Devout and deeply conservative, Mariana believed the Habsburg blood was sacred. So she masked her son's incapacity with rituals and a show of royal grandeur. During her regency, corruption spread throughout the court. Officials exploited the king's helplessness to enrich themselves. The army weakened, the treasury emptied, and territories rebelled. But Mariana relied only on the church and her inner circle, hoping God would save the empire. When Charles came of age, he merely replaced his mother in name. In truth, he took part in almost no political decisions. During hours-long meetings of the royal council, he would just sit, occasionally nodding or mumbling a few inaudible words. Major decisions on taxes, war, and diplomacy were fought over by palace factions, each trying to control Charles to legitimize their power. The result of his reign was a period of terrible decline. Spain sank into chronic financial crisis. The gold and silver from Latin America dwindled. War expenses drained the treasury, and corruption ran rampant. Peasants were crushed by taxes, merchants went bankrupt, and the people starved. Spain's international prestige collapsed. Once a superpower, the country became a laughingstock among Europe's courts, where everyone knew the throne was propped up by invisible hands. And the greatest tragedy of all was the succession crisis. Illness rendered Charles infertile. This beat the two marriages. For his entire life, the question, who will inherit the throne, was his greatest nightmare, eventually leading to the War of Spanish Succession, a bloody conflict that reshaped the map of Europe. Some historians say Charles didn't truly rule, but merely existed. He was a necessary symbol that allowed nobles to retain power. Yet many contemporaries pitied him. They said he was deeply devout, in spending hours in prayer, yearning for love but trapped in isolation. Whenever he fell seriously ill, he feared dying without an heir, leaving Spain a battlefield for foreign powers. Though unfit to lead, Charles was still human, burdened by the weight of the Habsburg name. Imagine a king on his throne, hands trembling as he clutches a crucifix, his deformed face staring down at ministers fighting over petty privileges. In that moment, he was no longer a monarch, just a child who never truly grew up, placed in the wrong role at the wrong time. Under Charles II, Spain's economy spiraled into a prolonged crisis that many historians call the long death rattle of what was once Europe's mightiest empire. In the previous century, Spain had grown rich from a flood of gold and silver from the New World. But by the time Charles ascended the throne, those precious metals had dwindled, drained by endless wars, corruption, and the high cost of defending a sprawling colonial empire. The royal treasury was empty, yet the court continued to spend lavishly to uphold the illusion of royal splendor. Agriculture, the backbone of Spain's economy, collapsed due to natural disasters and poor management. Years of failed harvests drove food prices sky high, leaving the population starving, while landlords ruthlessly collected taxes. The once thriving wool and textile industries of Castile plummeted under competition from England and the Netherlands. Trading cities like Seville and Toledo withered, their streets deserted by merchants. Taxes under Charles II were notoriously harsh. To fill the budget, the crown introduced new levies, from salt taxes to window taxes, draining the middle class and impoverishing the poor. Meanwhile, the nobility and the church, who owned most of the land, paid almost nothing. The tax system was convoluted and corrupt. Local officials embezzled funds, filed false production reports, and kept the court in constant deficit. Foreign debt became a dangerous habit. The court borrowed endlessly from Genoese merchants, Dutch banks, and German traders. By the end of Charles's reign, public debt had swollen so much that Spain was nearly bankrupt. Economic decline further weakened the military and navy. The Spanish fleet, once dominant across the Atlantic, no longer had enough warships to protect its treasure ships. English and Dutch pirates raided convoys from the Americas, further draining the treasury. In the colonies, local governors plundered resources, sending back to Spain only what little remained. In addition, plagues and successive crop failures swept through the land, especially the great outbreak of plague at the end of the 17th century, causing a devastating decline in population. The labor force shrank, prices soared, and many villages were abandoned. Amid such turmoil, the court implemented no effective reforms. The patchwork measures such as issuing debased currency, silver mixed with copper, only worsened inflation. Overall, Spain under Charles II resembled a withered body incapable of healing itself. All the wealth and glory of the eras of Charles V and Philip II had vanished. Peasants suffered. Merchants fled. Soldiers went unpaid, while the court drowned in elaborate rituals, masking its decay with grandiose religious processions. One historian described this period with a haunting image: an enormous empire wearing a torn golden cloak, beneath which lies nothing but a withered skeleton. Duster. Politically, Charles II's reign was an era of chaos and stagnation, where the Spanish court no longer had the vitality to lead and merely persisted through outdated customs and endless ceremonies. Due to the king's poor health and feeble mind, real power fell into the hands of palace factions and noble families vying for influence, leading to a court plagued by intrigue and competing cliques. In his youth, power was centralized under his mother Queen Regent Mariana of Austria, who held sway over the government for many years. Mariana was a devout extremist, believing she had a divine mission to safeguard the throne for her frail son. But she was completely dependent on her close advisors, the most notorious being a German cleric named Juan Everardo Nithard, despised for his ambition and greed. As Charles grew older, various factions began to resist his mother's autocracy. A conservative group led by Don Juan José de Austria, the illegitimate son of Philip IV, forced the Queen Regent into temporary retirement. But even Don Juan could not rescue the country from decline. All factions were too consumed by infighting to agree on tax reform or military modernization. While the people endured economic collapse, the court remained absorbed in holy relic processions and opulent festivals. As if ritual could mend the rot devouring the empire from within, Spanish diplomacy under Charles II also lost its direction. The court could no longer lead Catholic Europe as it once had during the height of Habsburg power. Many territories in Italy and the Netherlands gradually fell under French influence. While England and the Netherlands rose as dominant trading powers, far outpacing Spain. The greatest fear was succession. Charles had no children. His health was failing, and the question of who would inherit the crown haunted all of Europe. France and Austria quietly prepared for the day the Spanish throne would be vacant. In the Madrid court, factions argued fiercely. One supported the Bourbons, hoping to give the crown to the grandson of Louis XIV to preserve Catholic unity. The other backed the Austrian Habsburgs to maintain dynastic tradition. As Charles II neared death, the court lived in an atmosphere of panic and suspicion. Foreign envoys watched every move, waiting for their moment. At one point, Charles was persuaded to sign a will naming an heir only to be forced by opposing factions to revoke it, and then sign again, over and over. Finally, in exhaustion and desperation, Charles left a will naming Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, as his successor, thus igniting the 13-year-long War of the Spanish Succession. If one had to summarize Spanish politics under Charles II, a historian might need only one sentence. It was the slow collapse of a dynasty incapable of saving itself, where ritual and blind faith replaced reality and reform, and where the fate of an empire was decided more by those who arranged a will than by a sovereign ruler. From childhood, Charles was raised in an environment of near absolute piety. His mother, Queen Regent Mariana of Austria, was deeply devout, believing every event in life was a divine test. She organized relic processions and collective prayers lasting weeks, especially during her son's frequent illnesses, so frequent that some historians remarked, the court of Charles resembled a monastery more than a royal court. Emma. inside the main hall of the Alcazar Palace in Madrid, where Charles was often carried out for prayer ceremonies. The walls were covered with paintings of martyrs, relics of hand bones, sacred cloths, rosaries, and statues of the Virgin Mary. Whenever royalty fell ill, the Eucharist procession would circle the city, thousands of faithful kneeling in the streets, heads bowed low, pleading for miracles. This deep-rooted faith stemmed from Spain's history, a country that had fought for centuries in the Reconquista against Islam, and saw itself as the sword of Catholicism. In Charles II's time, that pride became a hollow display of lavish rituals, for no one in court had the strength to reform the backward nation. Religion had become both the only refuge and a tool to maintain order. As the economy collapsed, taxes weighed heavily, and the military weakened, people clung even more desperately to faith. Charles II grew up among whispers that he was the king God tested most severely to glorify eternally. Some believed his grotesque illnesses, jutting jaw, massive tongue, and uncontrollable seizures was proof of God's mysterious selection. The Spanish royal court maintained elaborate, unimaginably expensive religious ceremonies. Each Holy Week, floats bearing statues of Christ and the Sorrowful Virgin were carried through the streets, draped in black velvet, surrounded by hundreds of candles and the blare of brass trumpets. People hoped such solemnity would soothe the people's discontent. Even as lines of beggar children stretched through the streets outside, alongside public rituals, religion also seeped into palace life in the form of superstition and fear of divine wrath. Queen Maria Ana was devoted to hermits and exorcists. She invited many clerics to examine the curse she believed political enemies had placed upon her son. At one point, Charles II himself believed he was possessed by demons, a curse that rendered him infertile and caused his body to deteriorate day by day. This excessive piety created a stifling atmosphere within the court. Every major decision, from appointing officials, signing treaties, to drafting succession wills, had to be accompanied by collective prayer and consultation with confessors. Many foreign envoys joked that Madrid under Charles II was no different from a large diocese, only missing a formal pope. A key feature of Spanish religious life at this time was the Inquisition. Although by the 17th century it had weakened compared to its golden age, it still operated as a tool for suppressing beliefs deemed heretical or disloyal to the faith. Throughout Charles II's reign, quiet trials continued, and converted Jewish families were still surveilled, accused, and at times had their property confiscated. Yet the Inquisition had become a quiet shadow, no longer the fearsome symbol of power it had been under Ferdinand and Isabella. Like the court, it had grown ceremonial, ineffective, and lost its prestige, existing only as a shell to maintain the illusion that Spain was still God's warrior. Notably, Charles II was not opposed to reform. He was simply too weak to resist or support any change. And because he lacked the capacity and will to govern, religion became the only pillar keeping the court from total collapse. Ceremonies, processions, and collective prayers served to preserve the people's loyalty only through the fragile hope that God would save Spain at the last moment. The royal family's absolute piety turned the throne into a sacred symbol more than a political one, and that passivity contributed to pushing the country into the arms of war. When Charles II died without an heir, his funeral attended by hundreds of priests, thousands of candles, and mournful hymns resembled a farewell not only to a king, but to an old order already rotting from within. And when the coffin was laid in the royal crypt, surrounded by carvings of angels and martyrs, some courtiers whispered, "We prayed for decades, but no miracle ever came." Close your eyes and imagine the scene: incense smoke rising from silver bowls, candlelight flickering over the lifeless faces of saintly statues. While outside, the people quietly looked at one another, knowing that prayer alone would not be enough to save a crumbling empire. If tonight you shudder while hearing this story, remember, faith without wisdom becomes a golden prison where people lock themselves away with sacred illusions that never come true. More than a century earlier, Spain possessed the finest fighting force in Europeta Tercios, legendary infantry known for iron discipline, who had triumphed in Flanders, Italy, and across the Mediterranean. But by the late 17th century, under Charles Day, that glory was only found in history books. Not because the soldiers lacked courage, but because all the foundations of Spanish military power, finances, logistics, leadership had decayed. Let's begin with the military budget. Prolonged wars, especially with France and the Netherlands, drained enormous funds. Meanwhile, the treasure shipments from the Americas grew increasingly scarce, and the cost of maintaining garrisons across Europe from Milan, Naples, and Flanders to South America became an unsustainable burden. Taxes crippled the people, yet the treasury remained empty, leaving soldiers unpaid for months. One historian recorded scenes of Madrid's guards in tattered uniforms, worn-out boots, holding only rusty muskets, as reminders they still served the royal army. Financial weakness led to outdated equipment. While Louis XIV's French army had modern cannons and artillery, Spain still relied on old matchlock muskets, many with worn barrels. Supplies were so scarce that at times, soldiers had to purchase their own ammunition and clothing. Discipline declined. Desertion was rampant, partly because soldiers went unpaid, partly because many had been forcibly conscripted. Not only the infantry faltered, Spain's navy also fell victim to prolonged crisis. In the 16th century, Spain had commanded the treasure fleet, the Armada de la Carrera, that escorted silver and gold from the New World to Seville. But under Charles II, this fleet was in shambles, lacking maintenance funds. Many warships were no longer seaworthy. English and Dutch pirates attacked the treasure convoys with growing boldness, even raiding them near Spain's own shores. Admirals wrote desperate letters to the court, but Madrid could offer nothing but empty promises. On the mainland, Spain still had to maintain garrison forces across its European territories, especially in Flanders. Royal troops frequently clashed with the French in drawn-out skirmishes with no decisive victories. Each battle left a fresh wound on the treasury and morale. In many campaigns, Spanish forces had to rely on Austrian allies and Italian mercenaries, as the native troops were no longer strong enough. In terms of leadership, Charles II's court was trapped in a cycle of appointments based on factional loyalty and noble lineage rather than merit. Many aging, conservative generals, lacking any spirit of innovation. They held military command simply because they were relatives of powerful families. Meanwhile, younger, more capable officers were sidelined or never given a voice. To mask the weakness, the court maintained grand military ceremonies. Whenever King Charles appeared carried out to a golden chair in the square, the royal guard still raised flags, fired salutes, and paraded with pomp. But behind those neatly dressed ranks stood soldiers suffering from hunger, unpaid wages, and a deep lack of faith. A French diplomat once remarked bitterly, "The Spanish army looks like a play, beautiful in ritual, hollow in substance." Then, still, the soldiers' loyalty was undeniable. Many fought to the brink of collapse for the honor of their country. But that honor was no longer enough to withstand the truth. Spain was no longer a superpower. The final military campaigns under Charles II, especially in the Netherlands and Milan, were desperate efforts to preserve the illusion of power that had long vanished. When Charles II died, the Spanish army was no longer capable of defending the borders. That void opened the door to the War of the Spanish Succession, as Europe's powers saw Spain as ripe for the taking. In many later battles, Spanish forces had to rely entirely on French or Austrian allies to hold the line. Numerous border cities fell due to weak defenses, starving troops, and broken morale. Imagine one final night of the dynasty. In a cold fortress in Flanders, a group of old guards sits around a fire, patched cloaks draped over their shoulders. Outside, winter wind howls through cracked walls. In the distance, French and English troops begin to raise their flags over the border posts. Back in Madrid, On the throne lies a dying king, an ailing symbol of a once great military that had collapsed. The daily life of the Spanish people under Charles II was a long chain of hardships, plagued by famine, disease, and crushing taxes spared only for the nobility and clergy. Peasants, the vast majority of the population, farmed land they didn't own. Most land belonged to noble families or the Catholic Church, both of whom were tax-exempt and enjoyed centuries-old privileges. Tenant farmers paid heavy rents, plus royal taxes, salt taxes, road tolls, and countless local fees. In rural Castile and Andalusia, crop failures were frequent. Records speak of years when barley bore no grain, when swarms of locusts blanketed the fields, leaving only scorched stubble behind. Tax collectors still went door to door, collecting grain, wool, and olive oil, forcing peasants to sell even their seeds and livestock, trading tomorrow's harvest for today's survival. In the cities, particularly Seville and Toledo, trade declined after the Golden Century. Textile workshops shut down, unable to compete with English and Dutch wool goods. Artisans, porters, small traders all fell into mass unemployment. Once bustling streets turned bleak, with only a few shops clinging on by slashing workers' wages to the bare minimum. In large cities, the poor gathered around monastery gates and churches, hoping for a ladle of charity porridge. Charities and religious groups tried to help, but the need was overwhelming. Accounts speak of families scavenging vegetable peels and bone scraps from noble kitchens to feed their children. Poverty bred theft, prostitution, and gambling, prompting authorities to increase nighttime patrols but never addressing the root causes. Disease was another specter haunting Spain throughout the 17th century. The plague flared repeatedly, sweeping from coastal ports into the interior. In some villages, half the population perished within months. With medicine still primitive, people could only pray and parade relics through city streets, clinging to hopes of a miracle. Charles II once ordered mass repentance ceremonies, believing piety might drive away disease, but the plague showed no mercy. Ironically, amid all this darkness, the nobility and clergy continued to live in splendor, hosting lavish feasts, ornate weddings, hunting trips, and building new estates. Though the royal treasury was bankrupt, they believed the dignity of their noble blood exempted them from responsibility. This injustice sparked a smoldering resentment among the people. Yet Spain's deeply religious society meant most of the poor believed their suffering was God's will, and that patient endurance would be rewarded in heaven. That belief helped them survive year after year of deprivation, but also inadvertently sustained the decaying social order. In border regions like Catalonia and Aragon, people suffered even more from war. French and English troops frequently raided villages, stealing food, burning homes. Villagers fled to the mountains, carrying with them a few sacks of seeds and crucifixes, the last of their possessions. Children grew up to the sound of war drums and the smell of smoke, never knowing what a classroom looked like. Education was nearly the exclusive privilege of monastic orders and the nobility. Most peasants were illiterate. And even in the cities, the majority of craftsmen couldn't read. Monasteries maintained small schools that taught children to read Latin prayers and the alphabet, but offered no practical skills or useful knowledge. This left Spanish society lagging behind England, France, and the Netherlands, where commerce and intellectual life were beginning to flourish. Spiritually, the people of Spain under Charles II clung to old customs, religious fairs, Eucharist processions, penitential weeks filled with masses and collective confession. In every village, the church was the center of life, a place where people sought peace from their fears. Many families believed the nation's misfortunes were punishments for their own sins, a belief both painful and resigned. When Charles II died and the empire began to collapse, nothing changed immediately for the common people. They still rose before dawn to work the fields, still feared the tax collector, still gathered dry firewood for winter, still quietly prayed for God's blessing. The political upheavals and power games between the Bourbons and Habsburgs felt to them like stories from another planet. Wonderful now. Relax. Because I'm going to tell you a comparison between Spain during the reign of Charles II and France under Louis XIV, to show why one empire, once equal to France, plummeted, while the other rose to dominate Europe. Imagine two opposing thrones. On one side, Madrid, where Charles II sat motionless in a twisted form. On the other, Versailles, where Louis XIV, Sunday King, strode in radiant splendor. Both nations believed they were chosen by God to lead Europe. But reality revealed two divergent paths. Politically, both Spain and France were absolute monarchies, but the stability of their rule differed greatly. In Spain, real power was fragmented among the regent queen, powerful families, and the church. Charles II was too weak to make decisions himself, and the court was mired in factional infighting. Every policy from tax collection to military movements to succession was delayed by suspicion and intrigue. In contrast, Louis XIV consolidated absolute power. After crushing the rebellious nobility in his youth, he built a loyal bureaucracy and turned Versailles into a center of aristocratic control. Louis was famous for saying, "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state." This wasn't just arrogance, it reflected reality. In France, no one could challenge the king's authority. Economically, Spain still relied on silver from the New World, a revenue stream already dwindling by the late 16th century. Domestic production was outdated. Trade had decayed, and oppressive taxes crushed peasants and small merchants. Meanwhile, Louis XIV and his ministers like Colbert pushed aggressive mercantilist policies, founding state-run factories, encouraging export trade, investing in merchant fleets, and building infrastructure. As a result, 17th century France, though burdened by war, remained far more dynamic than Spain's aging economy. Militarily, the contrast was even starker. Spain had once boasted the formidable tercios, but under Charles II, soldiers went unpaid, were poorly equipped, and desertion was rampant. The navy was so weakened it could no longer protect the treasure fleets. In contrast, Louis XIV turned the French army into the most modern force in Europe, with a vast standing army, advanced artillery, and brilliant commanders like Vauban and Turenne. France achieved stunning victories, expanded its borders, and made Versailles the political heart of the continent. In terms of religion, both courts were deeply Catholic, but they wielded faith differently. Charles II and the Queen believed every misfortune from the king's illnesses to failed harvests was divine punishment or a test. Religion infiltrated every decision, turning Madrid into a court burdened with ritual and superstition. France was also devout, but Louis XIV used religion as a tool to strengthen his rule. He required nobles to attend Versailles church services to demonstrate loyalty, dispensed favors through religious pageantry, but never let religion dictate his governance. In terms of national image, Spain under Charles II resembled a tired giant, struggling to maintain the splendor of a bygone century. France under Louis XIV confidently displayed its prosperity. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a stage for soft power. When Spanish envoys arrived, they were stunned by the grand ceremonies. Music, gilded ceilings, and crowds of nobles reverently surrounding the king like a god. Meanwhile, Charles II had never even addressed his nation. He lacked both the strength and the presence to do so. In the long run, this contrast sealed the fate of the two empires. Spain, after Charles II's death, plunged immediately into the War of the Spanish Succession, losing key territories and its superpower status. France, though exhausted by war, retained its dominant influence in Europe for decades to come. If you try to close your eyes and imagine two royal courts, on one side, Charles Ducal, trembling, clutching a crucifix, surrounded by whispering courtiers vying for control of his will. On the other, Louisa Dynasty Majestits, commanding, stepping up to the pulpit before the full council. You will understand why one empire collapsed, while the other at least temporarily maintained its prestige. But don't forget that both paths came at a cost. France, after Louis XIV, also fell into exhaustion, entangled in wars and debt. Power, once it becomes an obsession, will eventually strip a nation of its soul, no matter how radiant it first appears. Tonight, as you lie still under the covers, remember, those deformed faces in old portraits are not merely relics of history. They are reminders that unchecked ambition will, sooner or later, consume the very ones who nurture it. The story of Charles II ends here, like a long sigh echoing across the centuries, a dynasty born of fanatical belief, and dying in silence, alone. If this story stirred something in you, leave a comment to let me know you're still listening. And if you wish, I'll continue with other Talus secrets the textbooks never dared to tell. But the story of royal bloodlines trapped in their own cages didn't end with the Habsburgs. Tonight, if you have the patience, I will take you far from Spain, across snow-covered mountains, to ancient Egypt, where another dynasty was haunted by the obsession to preserve divine blood purity and, in doing so, planted the seeds of its own downfall. Have you heard of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, the boy king entombed in the most famous golden burial chamber in the world? Tutankhamun ascended the throne as a child. He was called King Tut. And when his tomb was discovered, it became the symbol of ancient Egyptian civilization. But behind that gleaming golden mask, his real body tells a darker story few dare to mention. Like the Habsburgs centuries later, his dynasty believed that intra-family marriage was the only way to safeguard the royal bloodline believed to descend directly from the sun god Ra. Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings Akhenaten and one of his sisters. They married not for love, but out of ancient tradition. Only children born from the same divine bloodline are truly worthy to rule Egypt. As a result, when Tutankhamun was born, he carried all the genetic flaws accumulated through generations of incestuous unions. His skeleton reveals a severely deformed left leg, likely causing him to limp for life. His foot was afflicted with a clubfoot deformity, so twisted he needed canes to support every step. It didn't end there. Scientists also discovered he suffered from numerous other ailments, an unusually elongated skull, signs of bone degeneration, and likely endured recurring bouts of malaria before his death. In ancient murals, he is depicted holding scepters, wearing a crown, but in truth, he was a frail young man, plagued by pain and physical limitation. By the end of his short life, Tutankhamun died suddenly at just 19. The exact cause remains debated. Some theories suggest he succumbed to infection after a leg fracture, others to complications from malaria and exhaustion. But regardless of the final cause, there is consensus. His brief life was the product of a long legacy of incestuous royal tradition. Just think, ancient Egyptians believed they were preserving sacred purity, but that belief destroyed the very children born inside the palace. They didn't realize that divine blood, if never opened to fresh life, becomes a slow-acting poison. And like Charles II, Tutankhamun became the final witness of a power dream rotting from within. If you are still lying in the dark, I hope this story reminds you, some legacies, the more tightly we cling to them, the more twisted and terrifying they become. Tonight, as you close your eyes, you may glimpse the golden face of King Tut, but behind that glittering mask is only a child who was never free from the fate sealed for him before he even left his mother's womb. Tutankhamun was born into a dynasty of upheaval. His father Akhenaten was the heretic pharaoh who tried to dismantle Egypt's polytheistic traditions and force the entire empire to worship the sun god Aten alone. Thus, from birth, Tutankhamun was seen as a seed of restoration, meant to bring back the old order. But no one spoke aloud of a more silent truth. The boy was the product of many generations of incest, Modern DNA analysis has revealed that Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, brother and sister, born of the same mother and father, and at least 3 generations before them were also confined to closed-loop marriages from the moment he was in the womb. Tutankhamun's small body bore the burden of these consequences. All archaeological evidence shows he was born with multiple congenital deformities, a club foot, so tightly twisted he could not walk normally, partial necrosis of the tibia, which may have led to his death after a fall, an unusually elongated skull condition called dolichocephaly, linked to abnormal cranial development. These deformities were not only physical burdens, they were an invisible curse pressing down on a boy destined to be pharaoh. Imagine, in a royal court where all subjects must bow at the mention of his name, stood a fragile, pale king who always needed a cane. In his tomb, archaeologists found 130 ornately carved walking sticks. Many once thought these were symbols of power, but modern studies confirm he truly needed them for daily mobility. Tutankhamun's short life was also marked by profound solitude. He took the throne at just 9 years old, a child too young to wield a sword, too innocent to grasp politics, yet forced to wear a golden mask and shoulder the identity of the son of the sun god. No one knows exactly what he felt. Did the boy understand why his body was different? Why each step brought pain? Why each night he fell asleep to the whispers of priests debating the fate of the empire? As he grew older, Tutankhamun was arranged to marry Ankhesenamun, his half-sister. This marriage continued the cycle of incestuous genetics, as no one dared to break tradition. In his tomb, archaeologists discovered 2 tiny mummified fetuses placed beside him. These are believed to be his daughters, lost before they ever took a breath. None of his children survived, and he left no direct heir. In the end, at just 19, he died suddenly. Some theories suggest that during one of his painful walks, he fell and fractured his femur. The wound became infected, and combined with chronic malaria, his body gave out, and so, a dynasty thought to be immortal, guarded by the gods, he came to an end with a single fall. But when his body was placed in that golden coffin, and the priests chanted their prayers, no one dared to speak the deeper truth behind the tragedy. No one admitted that all this suffering, all this misfortune, stemmed from a blind belief that pure blood was worth more than anything else. More than 3,000 years later, when Howard Carter uncovered the tomb, the world was stunned by its treasures, but behind all the glittering gold was a frail, wasted, tiny mummy. Are you still awake? If you're still hearing my voice, imagine a freezing winter night in Russia, when the sky hangs like a heavy gray shroud over the roof of the Alexander Palace. Behind frozen windows, dim yellow lights fall on red-carpeted halls. There, a dynasty once thought invincible is gasping its last breaths. The Romanovs ruled Russia for over 300 years, from the first Tsar, Mikhail, to the last, Nicolas II, who finally bowed to the weight of collapse. People often think the dynasty fell because of war, revolution, or the hunger of the masses. All of that is true, but more deeply, it was the tragedy of a family who locked themselves inside the shell of grandeur, unable to hear the cries of a nation in agony. Nicholas II was not a cruel man. He was often described as a gentle father, a devoted husband, but he was also the perfect example of a king born in the old world, one who never learned to face change. He ascended the throne in 1894. At just 26, his vast kingdom stretched from the frigid Baltic Sea to the distant Pacific shore. In the Winter Palace, Nicholas wore a diamond-studded crown and heard the thunder of saluting cannons while millions of Russian peasants still lived in mud huts. His wife, Alexandra, a German princess, brought a mystic faith into the Russian court. She would later place all her trust in Grigory Rasputin, a wandering monk with eyes like fire and foreboding prophecies. Rasputin convinced the empress that God had chosen him to save the Romanov family, and Alexandra believed it so deeply. She ignored every voice of caution, but there was a reason she desperately sought a miracle. Their son, Alexei's child she loved more than anything suffered from hemophilia. A single bruise could kill him. Every night, the Empress stayed awake, listening to his breathing, wondering if she would lose him before dawn. Meanwhile, Russia spiraled into crisis. War with Japan, then World War I. Drained soldiers and coffers. Famine spread across provinces. Workers went on strike. Ragged crowds marched on St. Petersburg demanding bread and peace. Yet inside the palace, Nicholas and Alexandra still believed they were favored by God. They believed the Romanov bloodline linked by 3 centuries of rule would shield the throne from any storm. They were wrong. In March 1917, under crushing pressure, Nicholas abdicated. The family was placed under house arrest in the Alexander Palace, then sent to Siberia. They were no longer Tsar and Empress only, a broken family, walking together into a night without return. Imagine the scene, a July night in 1918. Inside the Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg, the Bolsheviks had decided they would no longer keep the Romanovs as hostages. The family was awakened at dawn. Nicholas carried the frail Alexei, wrapped in a wool sweater, while Alexandra clung to her eldest daughter, Olga. Trembling, they were led down to the basement. The yellow ceiling light cast a sickly glow on their pale faces. An officer read a brief execution order. No one had time to react. Gunshots echoed against the brick walls, followed by a chilling silence. Later, survivors recalled that in his final moment, Nicholas turned to his wife and looked at her one last time. That gaze no longer belonged to a king, it was the gaze of a helpless husband, knowing everything was over. And it was. With their deaths, the Romanov dynasty vanished like a shadow. But the story doesn't end there. Because the legacy of the Romanovs is not just the tragedy of that night in Ekaterinburg, it is also a warning. A warning of what happens when a family believes it is chosen, when it values honor and noble blood over responsibility to the people suffering beyond palace walls. Decades later, when historians exhumed the mass grave, they found fragments of broken bones, traces of acid poured on the bodies in an attempt to erase evidence, but nothing could erase the truth. Power, even when sanctified, cannot escape guilt and consequence. Are you still awake? If you're still listening, let this story settle in your memory, like a whisper from the past. Never believe that any bloodline is so noble it can protect people from collapse. Perhaps the most painful truth is this: those royal courts were not entirely ignorant. They saw how many children were born still, how many monarchs suffered Zeitzurs, deformities, or madness. They knew, or at least vaguely sensed, that this was the price of stubbornness. But they couldn't stop because the pride of royal blood had become a dangerous faith. In that society, a newborn child was not seen as a human being, but as a political tool, living proof of a legitimate right to rule. And if the child was born deformed, infertile, or weak, no one dared say the real cause was generations of inbreeding. Instead of taking responsibility, they blamed witches, demons, or the wrath of God. Picture Charles II, placed on the throne before he could even speak clearly, surrounded by helping hands and advisors ready to feud over power, but not one of them brave enough to break the chain of inherited disease. Because to them, losing a little bloodline purity was more terrifying than any curse. That is the bitter paradox. Royal incestuous marriage was born out of a desire to protect power. But in the end, it became the fuse that ignited the collapse of thrones. Spain, after Charles II, lost half its empire and slid from superpower status. The Austrian Habsburgs weakened, and their legacy became a cold reminder for future generations. If tonight you lie silently in the dark, remember, nowhere on this earth is any bloodline worth sacrificing the health and future of a child. Even if they wear robes embroidered with coats of arms, even if they bear crowns studded with diamonds, they are still just human, born of flesh and blood, as fragile as all of us. Royal incestuous marriage, when looked at in its essence, is not about nobility or purity. It is the ultimate symbol of the delusion that power can defy the laws of nature, that a throne can exempt humans from the cost of pride. And yet, from Egypt to Spain, from the pharaohs to the Habsburgs, history has proven no throne can stand firm when it locks itself inside a closed genetic cage. Ask yourself this: why did so many dynasties willingly repeat a mistake they knew the consequences of? Why, after witnessing so many deformed infants, early deaths, or powerless kings, did they continue the same cycle? The answer lies deep within human psychology: the fear of losing control. Royal inbreeding wasn't just a strategy to maintain power. It was the most extreme expression of the desire to control fodder, so much so that it ignored the boundaries of nature. In castles behind guarded gates, where everything was dictated by bloodlines and rituals, people began to believe that noble blood was a talisman, that as long as it remained pure, they would be invincible. But in truth, blood does not obey commands. It is not loyal. It does not bow to titles or royal decrees. It follows a logic far quieter than any authority, the logic of genetics, which people of that time did not understand, but still had to bow to. Picture a little princess, born into a velvet-draped palace, with her fate sealed from the moment she opened her eyes. You must marry within the family. No one asked what she wanted. No one cared whether she was afraid or repulsed. Her marriage wasn't for love, it was to preserve the myth that pure bloodlines were worth more than anything else. In many dynasties, after the death of a sickly child, all they could do was hold a grand funeral and then quickly arrange another incestuous marriage. They repeated the tragedy with calm faces, as if the suffering of a child was negligible compared to the fear of the throne being tainted by outside blood. The greatest tragedy was, everyone knew, all the courtiers, clergy, palace doctors understood that children born from incestuous unions were often weak, deformed. They had seen too many examples, from the Habsburgs to the Ptolemies, from Egyptian pharaohs to the Romanovs. But they didn't dare speak the truth, because speaking it would be heresy against the doctrine of divine blood. Can you see it? Royal incest was a form of collective self-deception. It cloaked itself in honor and ceremony, but at its core, it was born from insecurity, the belief that letting outsiders in would bring down the throne. Like a massive dam fortified by fear, the more they reinforced it, the more it cracked. Above all, it showed how power can distort the meaning of being human. A child, in any normal family, is born to be loved, nurtured. But in a royal household, a child was born to be a symbol, a pure piece of the genealogy. If the child didn't meet expectations, it was seen as the failure of an entire dynasty. Imagine Charles III, man who could never feed himself, who never spoke clearly, who had no children, and who was seen as a living curse. In his 39 years of life, he was never viewed as a person, only as the decaying emblem of a sickened pride. But what makes this story frightening is not just the suffering of Charles himself. It's the fact that an entire society lulled itself into believing that this was normal, deserved, noble. No, history books would later call it the price of self-deception. Perhaps the most bitter truth is that even after Charles II died, even after the Spanish Habsburg dynasty collapsed, no one dared say that it all began with an obsession over bloodlines. People blamed war, foreign conspiracies, God, but the naked truth was this: it was a centuries-long story of people locking themselves inside a golden cage called honor. No. So if tonight you close your eyes, remember, no bloodline is more precious than human happiness and dignity. No throne is big enough to justify turning children into sacrifices for the illusion of power. And every empire, no matter how glorious, will eventually face the consequences of placing honor above humanity. That is the true legacy of royal incestuous marriage. Stern reminder that history always collects its debt, and no one is exempt. All these stories, whether painful or dazzling, teach us a quiet lesson. Every ambition, no matter how sacred it may appear, must one day bow to the laws of nature. No throne is eternal. No bloodline immune to the cost of stubbornness. But when we listen to these stories, in the stillness of the night, we learn not only about the tragedies of distant royals, we learn about ourselves. We learn that true strength lies not in clinging to the past, but in having the courage to change, to break free from the golden cage someone else built around our lives. So if you're still restless tonight, let this story fade like a wisp of mist. Don't let it weigh your heart down. Because after all, history is where we lay our fierce sand, where we find the courage to move forward. Now, close your eyes. Let go of the worries of the day. Let your imagination drift across quiet fields, old towns glowing with oil lamps, and palaces that now exist only in ruins. Wishing you a deep sleep, peaceful, like a night unburdened by curses, unpressured by the need to become someone great. Oh, may you dream gently, in a place where you are always allowed to just be free, so whole, and needing to prove nothing to anyone. Sleep well.